Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on a really fascinating exploration into the connection between our brains and how we learn. You've shared a very compelling 1998 paper by O'Boyle and Gill with us, and it's really prompting us to investigate how findings from cognitive neuroscience research might actually, inform and shape educational practices in the classroom.
Exactly. This paper gets into a central idea that recent discoveries concerning how the brain is organized, especially when we look at gifted individuals and the distinctions between male and female brains, could hold pretty significant implications for how we approach education.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. The paper points out that the 1990s were famously dubbed the decade of the brain, right?
Yeah.
And there was a real shift happening. Instead of just focusing on the mind through cognitive psychology, researchers started looking more at the physical brain itself. And this wasn't just happening in isolation, was it?
No, not at all. There was this growing interest in figuring out how all this brain research could actually be applied in schools, in educational settings. It even led to a specific workshop back in '96 focused on bridging the gap between neuroscience and education.
Right.
So people were actively trying to connect these fields.
Okay. And while the 1998 Target article by Burns and Fox kind of gives a broad overview of this intersection, our deep dive today is going to zoom in a bit more.
Precisely. We're going to focus specifically on the research O'Boyle and Gill themselves did, looking at giftedness and sex differences. We're really building on the foundational ideas that Burns and Fox laid out, but getting into the specifics of O'Boyle and Gill's own work.
So the mission here, as I see it, is to really dig into how these neuroscientific findings about potentially different brain organizations could maybe lead us to new, perhaps more effective ways of teaching and learning tailored for different groups of students.
Absolutely, that's the core goal. So let's start by diving into the functional organization of the gifted brain. O'Boyle and Gill's work really investigates whether there's a sort of unique neurological pattern associated with exceptional intellectual ability.
And a key part of this involved mathematically precocious adolescents. These are kids scoring in the top, half percent on the age-adjusted SAT. That's a pretty elite group.
Extremely elite, yeah.
So what did their brains seem to be doing differently?
Well, one really interesting experiment used a dichotic listening test for syllables. Now, normally, if you or I took this test where different sounds like ba or ga are played into each ear at the same time, most people show a right ear advantage.
Okay, why is that?
It's generally because language processing is more specialized in the left hemisphere for most right-handed people. Information from the right ear gets a more direct route there. Sound coming into the left ear has to cross over through the corpus callosum, that big bundle of fibers connecting the hemispheres to get processed by the left hemisphere. That little detour can make processing just slightly less efficient. Ah, okay. Left hemisphere for language, right ear has the faster track. Makes sense. So what was different about these gifted kids?
What's really striking is that these gifted adolescents didn't show that typical right ear advantage. They were just as accurate identifying syllables whether they heard them in their left ear or their right ear.
Ah, so what does that suggest?
It suggests perhaps enhanced right hemisphere involvement even in processing language-related information for these individuals. It points to a real difference in how their brains are functionally organized compared to average ability peers.
That's quite surprising. You'd think language is mostly a left brain thing. So it's like their brains are using both sides more effectively, maybe.
That's one interpretation, yeah. More bilateral engagement, perhaps.
Sure.
They also used another interesting test, this free vision chimeric face test. Can you explain that one?
Sure. So this test shows people composite faces. Imagine taking half of a smiling face and putting it together with half of a neutral face.
Now, when people look at these, there's a well-known tendency to judge the face as happier if the smile is on the left side of the image, from the viewer's perspective.
Why the left side?
Because the left side of the visual field is primarily processed by the right hemisphere, and the right hemisphere is generally considered more specialized for processing things like visual spatial information and, importantly here, facial effect reading emotions on faces.
Got it. So left side of the face hits the right brain, which is good at emotions. Okay. And how did the gifted group react to these chimeric faces?
They showed the typical left side smile bias, but it was significantly stronger than in the average ability group. They were even more likely to see the face with the smile on the left as the happier one.
Interesting.
The researchers actually calculated something called a laterality quotient, or LQ, to quantify this bias. The gifted group had significantly more negative LQs, which indicates greater right hemisphere engagement in this task.
And this LQ score wasn't just some isolated measure, right? Didn't it correlate with their SAT scores? Exactly. Within the gifted group, the more negative the LQ, meaning the stronger the right hemisphere bias for the faces, the higher their SAT scores tended to be.
Wow.
So that really strengthens the idea that this enhanced right hemisphere involvement might actually be linked to their intellectual abilities in some meaningful way.
That's really compelling.
Yeah.
And they didn't just rely on these behavioral tests, did they? They also used EEG.
Yes, exactly. They used EEG to look directly at the brain's electrical activity, and those studies provided more support. They saw greater alpha power reduction in the right hemisphere of gifted individuals, especially males, while they were doing the chimeric face task.
And alpha power reduction means more brain activity.
Basically, yes. A decrease in alpha waves is often interpreted as that brain area being more active or engaged. So it's another piece of evidence pointing towards a more active right hemisphere in gifted individuals during this kind of information processing.
So, the big picture here seems to be that gifted individuals might have a qualitatively different brain organization, characterized by enhanced right hemisphere involvement, even for tasks we might not expect.
That's the key takeaway from their work, yeah.
So this leads to a crucial question. What does this mean for education? If their brains work differently, should we maybe teach them differently?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? O'Boyle and Gill suggest that the standard approach, just giving gifted kids more of the same stuff or making them go faster through the standard curriculum, might not be optimal. It might not be playing to their strengths.
So what's the alternative?
They propose that maybe classroom techniques that actively engage and capitalize on the contributions of both hemispheres could be more effective. Think about activities that blend the analytical left with the more holistic spatial right.
Like what, for example?
Well, maybe incorporating more spatial reasoning puzzles, visual problem solving, or even more creative open-ended projects that really force engagement from that right hemisphere rather than just advanced math drills or faster reading.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not just about more or faster, but maybe different ways of engaging with the material that align better with how their brains might be wired.
Exactly. It's about quality, not just quantity.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the other major area O'Boyle and Gill explored: sex differences in brain organization. Now, we know there are, on average, some observed differences in cognitive performance between males and females.
Absolutely. These are pretty well documented trends. Females, on average, often show advantages in things like verbal fluency, maybe fine motor skills. Males, again, on average, tend to perform better on tasks involving visuospatial processing, like mental rotation and sometimes quantitative ability.
So the question O'Boyle and Gill and others were asking is, could differences in how male and female brains are functionally organized underlie some of these cognitive differences?
Precisely. They hypothesized that variations in brain functional organization might play a role, particularly for skills like verbal abilities and mental rotation.
And the general consensus they cite in the literature at the time was,
The general idea floating around then, and still discussed, is that male brains tend to be somewhat more lateralized, meaning functions are more strongly localized to one hemisphere or the other. Female brains, in contrast, are often described as showing more bilateral functional organization, with functions potentially distributed more across both hemispheres.
okay, more specialized zones in male brains, more communication across hemispheres in female brains, generally speaking.
That's the rough picture, yes. And there's some evidence cited that supports this. For instance, they mention an fMRI study by Shaywitz and colleagues from '95. It found that during verbal tasks, males showed more focused activation in the left inferior frontal gyrus. Females, doing the same tasks, showed more diffuse activation across both the left and right inferior frontal gyrus.
Huh. So for language tasks, men using a specific spot on the left, women using areas on both sides. Interesting. Was there other evidence pointing in that direction?
Yes, they also mention an RCBF study that's regional cerebral blood flow by Deutsch and Halsey from '91. It looked at a phonological detection task. Males showed peak blood flow, suggesting peak activity in the left frontal region. Females, again, showed activation in both left and right frontal lobes.
So it seems like females might be engaging more cortical real estate, using both sides,
Yeah.
for these verbal tasks. Could that potentially explain the observed female advantage in some verbal skills, on average?
That's certainly the suggestion put forward. By engaging both hemispheres, perhaps females bring more cortical resources to bear on verbal processing, potentially conferring an advantage.
Okay. Now, what about the flip side? Tasks where males tend to show an average advantage, like visual spatial stuff, mental rotation. Did Gill and O'Boyle's own research look at brain activity there?
It did. Their 1997 study specifically looked at mental manipulation of shapes, circles, and arcs while recording EEG. They found males were generally more accurate, especially when the task involved rotation or transformation.
In their brain activity.
Crucially, during these tasks, males showed a pronounced asymmetric activation primarily in the right frontal lobe. That's an area strongly linked to visuospatial processing.
Ah, the right hemisphere again. But this time correlating with a male advantage on a spatial task. What are the females in that study?
Females, interestingly, showed higher overall levels of brain activation during these same tasks, and their activation was more bilateral, involving both frontal and temporal regions in both hemispheres. It was quite a different pattern from the more focused right frontal activity seen in males.
So what's the interpretation there? Different strategies, maybe?
That's the hypothesis. Perhaps males are relying more on a visual imagery-based strategy, mediated heavily by that right frontal lobe. Females maybe are employing a different approach, perhaps more reliant on verbal or structural descriptions of the shapes and their transformations, which could engage both hemispheres more broadly.
So, same problem. Potentially different mental approaches reflected in different brain activity patterns.
Exactly.
Okay, this naturally leads us into a pretty thorny area, the educational implications.
Mhm.
If there are average differences in how male and female brains process information, does this lend support to ideas like sex-segregated classrooms for certain subjects?
Well, O'Boyle and Gill are actually quite cautious here. They acknowledge the findings, both theirs and others, but they strongly advise against jumping to conclusions about classroom structure.
Why the caution?
Because while these average differences exist, there's also huge variability within each sex. Not all boys process spatial information the same way, and not all girls excel at verbal fluency using bilateral activation. The overlap between the sexes is substantial.
Right. So basing educational policy on averages could be problematic for individuals who don't fit that average profile.
Precisely. And they also raise the point that there could be significant social and emotional costs to segregation that might outweigh any potential unproven academic benefits. Their stance is really that much more research is needed. We need careful evaluation before considering such large-scale changes based on these average neurobiological differences. It's complex.
Definitely sounds complex. Okay, let's broaden out again and touch upon some further implications from cognitive neuroscience, specifically around brain plasticity and timing. Burns and Fox mentioned this, and O'Boyle and Gill weigh in too. Is there an optimal time for learning?
Well, there's the traditional view, as they note, that much of brain development, the basic architecture, is laid down pretty early, maybe largely complete by age 6 or so.
Uh-huh.
And this idea has definitely influenced things like the push for early intervention programs, Head Start, for example, and also the debate about the best age to learn a second language. The thinking is, let's leverage that period of supposed peak brain malleability.
That early window of opportunity idea. But O'Boyle and Gill seem to emphasize that the story doesn't end there, right? Plasticity isn't just an early childhood thing.
Exactly. They strongly argue that while early development is crucial, the brain retains significant plasticity throughout life. Learning itself is brain change. It involves strengthening or weakening synaptic connections, pruning old ones, maybe even some structural rewiring based on experience.
And this continues beyond childhood.
Oh, absolutely. They point out that synaptogenesis, the formation of new synapses, continues well into adolescence. And even the adult brain is capable of major reorganization.
You mentioned that really striking example of patients with syndactylly webbed fingers earlier. Can you recap that? It seems like powerful evidence for adult plasticity.
Yeah, it's a study by Mogelner and colleagues. They looked at the somatosensory cortex, the brain map of the body's surface in adults born with fused fingers. Before surgery to separate the fingers, the brain areas corresponding to those fused digits were also sort of fused or indistinct.
Right.
But after surgery, once the fingers could move independently and provide separate sensory input, the brain maps reorganized. The representations for the individual fingers became distinct. It's a clear demonstration of experience driving structural and functional change in the adult brain.
That's incredible. Experience literally reshaping the brain map. What about the musician study, the one on perfect pitch?
Right, the Schlag et al. Study. They used MRI and found that professional musicians with perfect pitch tended to have a larger planum temporale, an auditory processing area, and it was more asymmetric towards the left side compared to non-musicians or musicians without perfect pitch.
So, did early musical training cause this brain difference?
Well, that's the tantalizing possibility they raise. Maybe intensive early musical training drives this structural adaptation, but they're careful to point out that causality isn't clear. It's also possible that individuals born with this anatomical variation are simply more likely to develop perfect pitch and perhaps be drawn to music, the classic correlation versus causation issue.
The chicken or the egg? Still, it suggests a link between experience, brain structure, and ability, even if the direction isn't certain.
Definitely.
All these examples, though, really underscore the challenge, don't they? How do you actually translate these fascinating but often complex and sometimes correlational neuroscience findings into practical things teachers can do on Monday morning? Boyle and Gill mentioned the bridge too far argument.
They do, referencing Brewer's work. And it's a valid concern. You can't always draw a straight line from a finding about synaptic density or hemispheric activation patterns to a specific teaching method. It's often not that simple.
But O'Boyle and Gill don't think it's impossible, do they? They seem more optimistic.
They are. They strongly align with Goldman-Rakic's view that neuroscience must have implications for education, even if the path isn't always direct. Their perspective seems to be that educators, with their practical on-the-ground experience, are actually key players here. They suggest educators are in the best position to potentially see how these neuroscientific insights might resonate with what they observe in students, and to then devise and test classroom techniques informed by these ideas. It requires collaboration.
So it's about communication. Neuroscientists share the findings. Educators figure out how they might apply in the real world of the classroom.
Exactly. It needs to be a two-way street. Neuroscientists provide the insights about the learning brain. Educators provide the pedagogical expertise and the context to see if those insights can lead to effective interventions. It's about bridging that gap through ongoing dialogue and partnership.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, our look at O'Boyle and Gill's 1998 paper really highlights the potential for cognitive neuroscience to significantly inform how we think about education. Understanding more about brain organization, especially regarding giftedness and sex differences, and appreciating lifelong brain plasticity, these things offer valuable perspectives.
Absolutely. Even if the direct application isn't always straightforward, these insights push us to think beyond a one-size-fits-all model. They encourage us to consider the diversity of learners and how their brains might be processing information differently.
It challenges that standardized approach. So maybe a final thought to leave our listeners with. If we take these findings seriously, the different ways gifted brains might work, the average processing differences between sexes, the brain's continuous ability to change, how could our educational systems evolve? How can we better acknowledge and cater to this neurological diversity? And maybe, what are the most promising next steps for research to really strengthen that bridge between the lab and the classroom?
Yeah, those are the big questions, aren't they? How do we move towards more personalized, brain-informed education in a practical way? Definitely food for thought.
It certainly is a fascinating intersection with, clearly, a lot more to explore. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.